All right, I got the thumbs up from Mark, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our study this morning. Everybody get in here and find a seat. I know you're glad to be inside a building where it's nice and warm. Lynn, stop talking here in just a few seconds and find a seat. We'll definitely get started. I love Lynn. I just have to, you left yourself wide open, brother. Hey, certainly want to welcome everybody that's joining us online this morning. Look forward to studying God's Word with you this morning. Continuing our study of Proverbs. I'm going to go ahead and read Proverbs 12:1 because if I don't have your attention now, after I read this, I think I'll have it. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 1 says, "He who hates correction is stupid." I'm going to read that again. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 1, New King James Version. Listen up, Lynn. He who hates correction is stupid. This is very pointed. If you haven't guessed by now this morning, we're going to be looking at the Proverbs that deal with how we interpret, how we accept constructive criticism, how we deal with advice. Do we listen? A lot of translations use the terms reproof, rebuke. Those are terms that we don't really use in our everyday conversations, but it's this idea of, are we on the receiving end and being criticized for some fault? Has somebody noticed a behavior or action and they're expressing sharp disapproval? Or are we just being criticized? Not being criticized for the sake of being criticized, but it's this idea of constructive criticism. The proverb writer has a lot to say about how we should heed advice. When I say heed, it's this concept of taking notice of, paying attention to. Mary T's looking at you funny when I say that too. No. But again, some questions for you to consider this morning. Are you an advice giver or are you an advice taker? Do you give out advice as much as you take advice? What areas of your life are out of control? I'm going to go through a lot of Proverbs this morning. One of the greatest displays of human strength is this ability to control one's emotions, this idea of self-control. Proverbs 16:32, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty." Proverbs chapter 25, verse 28. "Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls." I also like Proverbs 27, verse 5 through 6. "Open rebuke is better than love that is carefully concealed. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful." When I read Proverbs 27, 5 through 6, you get the idea here that a wise person really accepts criticism, and a wise person recognizes criticism, advice, reproof, rebuke for exactly what it is, especially when it's from someone that's a brother or sister that has our best interest at heart. It's not this notion that somebody's trying to undermine us or cut us off. But if we're truly, truly wanting to be the best that we can be, we have a responsibility and we have a duty to accept advice, to accept criticism, and to do so in a very humble manner. It doesn't mean it's fun, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But again, the Proverbs is so rich when it comes to the instructions for accepting advice. And I got a text, whoever's in control, that Becky said we're not streaming right now, so just wanted to throw that out there. One who rebukes will gain more favor than one who flatters. There's a proverb that parallels that thought, 28:23 and 9 verse 8. I think it's very important for us to think about the people in our life that have loved us enough to set us aside whenever they have seen that we've kind of missed the mark, and they love us enough to have a very blunt conversation with us. I'm not going to ask for personal examples, but I know that we have all probably experienced that at some point in our life, and we should really value those times in our life when people love us enough to sit down and bring something to our attention, especially if it's something that's going to help us become a better child of God. Those who truly love us will correct us. Think about it from a parent's point of view. We love our kids, right? And when our kids are real little, they're prone to make decisions that are not always the best decisions. And as parents, we want to bring those kids in, and I'm not saying that we sit there and whack them over the head when they make bad choices or bad decisions, but we have to use those as teaching moments, as opportunities to help them to understand that, hey, look, what you've done here, this is not good. This is going to get you in trouble one day. As a little boy, I was always taught, don't ever call somebody stupid. That's wrong, right? But I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that, your choices, your decisions, those are stupid. And if you continue to do the same thing, make the same mistake over and over, I don't know what you call that. That's stupid. We want to learn from our mistakes. Those who truly love us will correct us. What about us? Do we always accept criticism, especially when it's warranted? Donna?
I had a very distinctive experience with this back probably, I don't know how old I was. I was old enough to know better about what I was doing, but when my good, close Christian friends came to me and said, look, this is what's going to happen if you don't change what you're doing. And, the attitude matters so much, the attitude of the people coming to you, because I knew they wanted nothing but the best for me and the other person that was being affected. And so, it will motivate you if you have the right heart to get it straightened out as quick as you can. So.
Yeah. I thank you for sharing that, Donna. And I've had those experiences as well. And Donna is so right. If we're going to go to somebody and give advice, we've got to make sure that we ourselves deliver that in a spirit of love and a spirit of concern, true concern, because the people on the receiving end, like Donna said, they'll be able to tell if you really love them or if you're going there just to play gotcha. I don't like taking advice. I never have liked taking advice from people that are in the business of just playing gotcha. But I'm certainly not above taking advice from people that love me enough to sit down with me and have a frank conversation with me. And I know that they've got my best interest at heart and they want me to be a better child of God. I have a duty and a responsibility as a child of God to be willing to listen whenever I've missed the mark and another brother or another sister comes to me and sits down with me and brings something to my attention. It's just as much my responsibility to have a heart of humility and a spirit that's willing to listen. Last week we talked about pride. And I can't help but study this lesson but not remember what we talked about last week, because I think pride is what gets in the way sometimes. We're just too stubborn sometimes to listen. You know, we don't like to admit when we're wrong. That's just human nature. We don't like to be told that, hey, Wes, man, you got this one wrong. Man, it bruises our ego. It hurts our pride. You know, and I'm not the one making this stuff up. You know, check it out in the book of Proverbs for yourself. But listen to what the proverb writer has to say about the individual that hates being corrected or refuses to be corrected, however you want to look at it. You know what Proverbs chapter 12 verse 1 says? I got your attention with that. It says, he who hates correction is stupid. Let's go ahead and read the first part of Proverbs chapter 12. That's just the last part. Proverbs 12:1. Whoever loves instruction loves knowledge, but he who hates correction is stupid. You know, we could probably stop there and, you know, do justice to this study, but we're not. We're going to go ahead and move on, because there's a lot that the writer has to say about the person that hates correction. Says that the person that hates correction is like a scoffer. Look at Proverbs chapter 15, verse 12. A scoffer does not love one who corrects him, nor will he go to the wise. You know, that's a very clear visual of a very foolish individual. Somebody that hates or refuses correction is somebody that, you know, neglects their own soul. They're not even thinking about their soul. Proverbs 15 verse 32. He who disdains instruction despises his own soul, but he who heeds rebuke gets understanding. And again, this word heed, it means to pay attention to listen. You know, if we're caught in a sin or we've become aware of a sin in our life, we have got to listen to those that love us enough to come to us out of love, and they're willing to sit down and have those frank conversations with us like Donna brought out. You know, we can't get our feelings hurt and go in a corner and pout like we did when we were in romper room as a 4-year-old. We have to have a heart of humility and a willingness to listen and to heed those rebukes and those reproofs and recognize that that's going to make us better. That's going to be pleasing to God. We're going to grow spiritually. We're going to mature.
Would you read your version again?
Yeah, I'm out of the New
32?
King James Version. Proverbs 15, verse 32. He who disdains instruction despises his own soul, but he who heeds rebuke gets understanding.
My version says, whoever ignores instruction despises himself.
Yeah.
To me, that's a little more emphatic
Yeah.
about a person. If you ignore it, you're definitely headed down the wrong path.
Right. You know, everybody has their struggles. It just happens to not be a struggle of mine. I don't mind taking advice because I've always wanted to know, how can I be better? I want to be pleasing to God. It's never, you know, don't get me wrong, I've got my struggles. But if somebody comes to me, especially a brother or sister in Christ, and brings something to my attention, I've always had an open heart about that. It doesn't mean that I necessarily like having my shortcomings or my sins brought to my attention, but I know that it's going to make me better. And I appreciate people that come to me and not around me. You know what I'm saying, right? It's like Donna said, those people came to her and had those conversations with her. They didn't go to other people and have those conversations. They went to Donna. And to this day, Donna, you remember the names of those persons. You remember those conversations probably just like they were yesterday, because they loved you enough to come to you and have those conversations. He who hates instruction, correction, refuses instruction, correction, despises his own soul, is led astray. Let's look at Proverbs 10:17. He who keeps instruction is in the way of life, but he who refuses correction goes astray. You know, we don't even have to talk about salvation or doctrinal issues. Just think about this in a general sense in the world we live in. Think about how many people out in our society are just so off path, off the charts, however you want to look at it, because they just simply refuse to listen to good, sound, practical advice. Hey, if you do this, this is the consequence. But people still go and do the same thing, even though they have been told, hey, don't do that, because if you do that, then this is going to happen. This idea of going astray. He who hates or refuses correction or instruction, shame's going to come to him. Proverbs 13, verse 18 says, poverty and shame will come to him who disdains correction, but he who regards a rebuke will be honored. You know, the people in my life that have brought things to my attention to where maybe I said something I shouldn't have, or maybe I just neglected to do something that I shouldn't have, I hope that the spirit in which I took that made them look at me in a favorable light, if you know what I mean. You know, it's easy to smile whenever somebody comes up and pats you on the back, right? But when somebody brings something to you that, you know, hey, Wes, you know, this wasn't really good what you did, and I take it and receive it in a loving manner with humility, I think that's the kind of stuff the proverb writer's trying to get us to think about is, you know, that's how we, you know, make ourselves, you know, more honorable. It's the spirit in which we take that criticism, that advice, and versus going off and pounding in a corner, you know. You know, I don't want to spend too much more time on this. I think you get the picture of what happens to a person that just isn't willing to listen. That's what this boils down to. You know, we could spend all morning talking about it, but you get the picture. Let's flip that around real quick. What about the person who hears? What about the person who is willing to listen to construction? The person that's willing to receive rebuke, reproof?
Wes, this brings to my mind, for those of us that work in an environment where we are basically subjected to people that are over, and basically our superiors or whatever, they have certain expectations. You come into this situation where whether you call it a yearly evaluation or monthly critiques or quarterly reviews, you constantly come into a situation where you are basically appraised on your performance. And so if you're not a person that's willing to do things the way that your boss tells you to do it, you're not going to be someone that they're going to really aspire to keep around, so to speak. And one of our brothers in the congregation here years ago used to say it, you know, one real good screw up will erase 3 attaboys. So you have to live your life in such a way that you have to be open to really trying to do what the expectations are. And I think our Christian life is certainly following along with that. If you can't find yourself and make yourself submissive to what God has established and ordained to be what He wants, then I think you're going to always struggle with this.
Good point. I see any other hands go up. All right, so we've looked at some negatives that can come from the person that just flat out is too stubborn, prideful to listen to good advice. What are some positives that can come, even when we've messed up, but yet we have a spirit of humility and we're willing to listen? What are some of the things that we're going to see unfold in our life? Well, there's a lot of Proverbs that talk about that. Let's look at Proverbs chapter 9, verse 8. It says, "Do not correct a scoffer, lest he hate you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love you." I think it carries this idea that people that desire to be wise, they're willing to listen. They're going to take advice and constructive criticism in the spirit that it's intended to be taken. That person's also going to be prudent. Look at Proverbs 15, verse 5. "A fool despises his father's instruction, but he who receives correction is prudent." Who in here doesn't want to be a prudent person? To go through life, careful, cautious. The person that hears and receives correction will be a person that is worthy of honor. We looked at Proverbs 13, 18 earlier. I want to read it again because it applies in this scenario. "Poverty and shame will come to him who disdains correction, but he who regards a rebuke will be honored." I'm going to go back to the example with my kids. It makes you feel really good as a parent whenever you have to correct your kids and they take it in the spirit in which you're trying to deliver it. It makes you feel like, man, I'm really doing something right as a parent. And I think that's the way it should be with us as God's people. Whenever brothers or sisters go to another brother or sister and bring something to their attention, man, let's take it in the spirit that it's intended to be taken in. If they love you enough to go to you and bring something to your attention, we need to make sure that we, avoid that tendency to let our ego get in the way, to let that old nasty pride interfere. And let's just take it in the spirit that it's intended to be taken.
I think it's definitely a judgment call that needs to be done in prayer. And you said something about not going to other people. I think it's okay to maybe discuss something with another Christian brother or sister, or even, an elder, before going to a brother or sister. Pray about it. Decide whether or not it's the best thing to go to that person. Because I know, especially with our children, teens, early 20, unfortunately, they sometimes don't have this maturity yet to be receptive to correction. And if we go to them, they're going to take it could turn them away from us, or turn them away from God or the church. So I think it's definitely maybe give it time, kind of see what happens in their life. And if it comes down to it, you may have to go to them. But I think it's definitely a judgment call. You need to think about love and think about keeping the peace.
I couldn't agree with you more, Katrina. And as having kids myself, I'm all about having wise counsel when it comes to visiting with our kids. Now I see another hand grow up, but great comment, Katrina. All right. Some of these proverbs I'm going to be repeating because I think it's worth repeating because they make a very strong point. Again, these are some positives that come whenever a person is willing to listen to advice. Let's go back to Proverbs 15. I want to read 31 through 33. The ear that hears the rebukes of life will abide among the wise. He who disdains instruction despises his own soul, but he who heeds rebuke gets understanding. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. So I think you really get the picture by this point. Man, it's so worth our while to listen to advice, especially when it comes from our brothers and our sisters in Christ. Now, I think there's some discernment when it comes to whenever we're giving advice from people in the world, and I'm talking about on the job and all that stuff. But for our purposes in this class, I'm talking about spiritual things this morning. That's what I really want us to focus on. The writer in Ecclesiastes had this to say: "It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools." And again, we just don't, we don't talk about this every Sunday. We talk about loving each other, and as we should, encouraging each other, but how often do we really have these pointed studies about, hey, if brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so is caught in a sin, man, we need to go to that person. But that same brother and that same sister, they have a responsibility, like we're talking this morning. They've got to have a heart that's open, receptive, and is clothed with humility. And that's easier said than done. I get that. The New Testament also has this to say about receiving instruction, rebuke, reproof, taking advice. You've heard this before. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and for instruction in righteousness. So here's a question for anybody to answer. What should I do if I'm rebuked or corrected? And again, we don't use this word rebuked a lot in everyday conversation. I get that. But again, if somebody has found fault with us or is expressing disapproval, how do we respond to that when that's brought to our attention? I guess that's the question. What kind of spirit are we supposed to have?
Immediately point out their flaws.
I'm not going to rush to my next point. I'm going to let that kind of sink in and let you think about it. Lynn's got his hand up.
When you talk about being corrected or rebuked, as Christians, we have to guard very carefully about how we respond to that, especially if we're dealing with a non-Christian. And we have to consider that source, and we have to consider how our response is going to be viewed by them. And are we exercising those things that we try to exhibit in our daily lives about how we're going to respond to that? Because it's our human nature is to immediately, like Woody said, well, really? Well, let me point out some of the things that you do wrong. We want to retaliate. We want to push back, especially if it's somebody that is either in a position of authority or has come to us with something that we don't think is founded in fact. If it's some kind of fake accusation, and how we respond to that is going to be a real measure of how we exhibit our Christianity to other people and how they see us respond. In the lesson this morning, Mac talked about how he had been asked at one point by a young man that he worked with years ago, you know, where do you go to church? And he said that's the only time anybody's ever asked him, well, why do you go to the Church of Christ? And later, you know, in his conversation, the young man revealed that he'd been raised in the Catholic Church, and he saw the way Mac lived his life, and that it was an exhibit of Mac's faith. And we have to be careful that our responses are the correct one, so that they see Christ living in us.
And Wes, we've been given instruction on how to respond. I mean, so many different scriptures report, you know, basically live peaceably with men.
Yes.
If you're persecuted, how are you to respond to that? To bless those. If your enemy needs drink or food,
Feed them.
yeah. I mean, so we have instruction on these things.
I think Batzel had his hand up.
You know, sometimes the way you rebuke somebody is not saying anything at all. Whenever my graduation, I partook in some beverages that I shouldn't have been partaking of. And my mom was in the stadium. She could tell that I was drunk. But Stacy and Betty Cook, I'd left the church completely. And they came up with a graduation gift. And the only thing Stacy ever said is, Batzel, we love you. That's it. You know, and whenever still to this day, if I'm doing something I shouldn't do or think about doing something, I still remember those words. You know, and he never brought it up again. It wasn't like he didn't know what I was doing, you know. But sometimes just a simple "we love you" would do a lot.
Right. I couldn't agree with that more, Batzel. I don't want to get off track or off course too much, because a couple of weeks ago we looked at the Proverbs that dealt with how we're, as parents, to raise our kids and treat our kids and so forth. And I can't help but, you know, continue to think about my role as a father with my own kids, especially as it relates to what we're talking about this morning. But I've been blessed to have really good kids. Now, there have been times where they have not always made really good decisions. And as a father, when I have sat down with them and tried to explain to them why I'm upset with the choices or the decisions they've made, sometimes they have immediately taken that in the proper manner, and they've made the adjustments and they've corrected that behavior. And then other times I get pushback. And anybody that's a parent, you know what I mean when I say pushback. And it can be very frustrating. It can be very aggravating, because as parents, and we were all the same way as kids once. Mom and Dad, they're old-fashioned, don't know anything, and now I'm in that role. But we love our kids, and we don't want them to do A, B, and C because of the consequences. And boy, it gets so frustrating when they push back. And it's just the same with our brothers and sisters too. I mean, the parent-child analogy is just as applicable to God's family. I mean, you know, brothers and sisters. So trying to tie all this together, you know, some of this really comes back to this idea of how do we get self-control. I think self-control is at the heart of a lot of this. I'm not trying to be funny, but if Lynn comes to me and brings some fault or sin to my attention, you know, I've got to be wise enough to sit down and really listen to what Lynn has to say. I've got to have enough self-control that I'm willing to look at myself and do some examination and tell myself, well, maybe Lynn has got a point. maybe what I said was off track. Maybe what I did was wrong. Bailey?
We're in the middle of parenting 2 little boys.
Good luck.
Yes. Lord be with us. And I think what I've realized is when I stay home all day, my temper gets short, and I get frustrated. And
That
during
never
the day,
happened to me.
yeah, well, some of us are just luckier than others. And so, during the day, I don't really have anybody to keep me in line or to tell me, okay, hey, well, okay, that's enough. And so as the day goes on and the day progresses, I try to be as mindful as I can be. But oftentimes when Kenton comes home, if I've just had a day of it, I may be in the middle of, I'm frustrated, I'm irritated or whatever, and I'm about to say something to the kids or I'm disciplining or whatever. And all too often, Kenton will be like, oh, whoa, hey, that's enough. Or, do you need to go somewhere? Like, he'll say something to me. And what I realized was at the very beginning, when he would first do that to me, oh, it would make me mad. Oh, it would make me mad. How dare you come into this house after I've been here all day with these children and say something to me like, But then I realized that when he would do that, normally I would just stop. And it would make me mad, and oh, it would make me mad. But if I would just almost not respond, I know it sounds terrible to say, but I would hear him, but I wouldn't say anything back. I would just listen. And normally, a little while later, I would realize there was a lot of truth in that. And by not immediately responding to him in frustration or anger, I realized that what he was saying to me was truthful. And I realized that by saying that to me at the time, I felt better having him say something that made me upset more so than how I would have felt if I would have continued on with the kids the way I was going. The times that I felt the worst was when he didn't say anything to me, and I maybe said something I shouldn't have said to the children, or I was too rough with the kids when I shouldn't have been, And so what I've realized is I feel like when people have the need to say something to you, if you can, no response is a response. And if you can just maybe take a back seat and say, if you can muster up the strength, I guess, to say, thanks for bringing that to my attention, can I talk to you about this later? And you go home and you think about it, I think you'll realize that there's more truth to what they're saying to you instead of the immediate response of getting mad or frustrated, because I think a lot of times people do realize later after the fact that, hey, I needed to be called out. You needed to tell me that. And I'm glad you did, because you kept me from doing something worse, something that I would feel worse about. So.
Man, you're a phenomenal mother, Bailey. Very, very good comment. I mean that seriously. I mean, you're doing a phenomenal job as a mother. You know what Proverbs 27:19 says? As in water, face reflects face, so a man's heart reveals the man. It stings whenever you get corrected, doesn't it? Have you ever been stung by a bee or a wasp? I mean, that you feel it. But it stings, it hurts. Call it what you want to call it, but man, if it comes from somebody that really loves you enough to come to you and really, out of a loving spirit, they're willing to have a difficult conversation. The wise man is going to see that and take that for what it is. And brothers and sisters, I'm not in the business of calling people stupid. But Proverbs 12:1 says, he who hates correction is stupid. I really, really want us to let that sink in. And T, you're my witness. I'm not calling anybody stupid, right? I'm just saying what Proverbs 12:1 has to say about this. Again, this comes back to this idea of self-control, how we internalize feedback, advice, especially from our brothers and sisters. What's our attitude? We can have the wrong attitude. we can, brush people off. Well, so-and-so, they don't know what they're talking about. Proverbs has a lot to say about that. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. There's that word again, heed. Paying attention to, taking notice of.
Hey, Wes. It makes me think, in today's day and time, we see a lot of things that we might judge to be somewhat unwise. But this problem must have been going on for quite a while.
Solomon wrote about it.
So it makes you wonder if this is just something that we're going to be faced with, especially outside of the church with the decisions that people make, and you wonder, why in the world would someone make those choices? And of course, in your line of work, I'm sure you see that every day. And we see it in every aspect of life, whether I see it with patients that are diabetic and they can't maintain their sugars, and so they're, then I get to make them a leg in a year or two, and then maybe another one the year after that, because they just make bad decisions. And so, of course, those things. So I think having a certain level of sympathy, but also when it comes to like raising kids, you only have a short period of time to make the training stick. And so it's different for each and every case. And so I look at it very individually when you're looking at whether you're trying to be the person that's receiving correction or whether you're in love trying to go to someone and try to help them make the right decisions. We're facing that with our children that are grown, and they're trying to make the right decisions, and at the same time they want to establish a certain level of independence. And it's very hard to, you want to tell them, hey, this is the best choice, but that's not the choice I want. I want to do it what I want to do. And so you have to try to explain to them so that they can see. Don't make rash judgments and make those decisions. So I think in a lot of ways, the Proverbs are talking about life situations and spiritual things with God. I think you anchor that to Scripture, and we have to hold fast to that, because I always think of obedience being belief and faith and versus unbelief. Those are the things that we anchor to.
Words from one of the greatest teachers. It's kind of hard to follow that up. I will follow it up by ending with one more Proverbs, because we're out of time. Proverbs 19:20 through 21 has this to say: Listen to counsel and receive instruction, that you may be wise in your latter days. There are many plans in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the Lord's counsel, that will stand. And that's probably a good Proverbs for me to end on and try to wrap all this up. So I hope that this lesson has benefited you in some way. It's always beneficial to me. And as always, thank you for your attention, especially your comments.